The summer of Warcraft is going strong as we return for our summer season of the Mythic Dungeon International. The time trials have been completed, and now it's time to get started with Cup Play. Hey, I'm Jack, and joining me on the desk for all your dungeoning needs, we've got Sloot, Nagura, and Tettles. How's it feel to be back?
It feels fantastic.
Awesome.
I'm feeling pretty good.
Wonderful. And with a new season comes new seasonal affixes, as we have the Beguiling, which is fairly new since it hasn't been that long since the patch comes in. So with Reaping out, Tettles, let's talk a little bit about these Beguiling mobs that these teams are going to be facing.
Yeah, so you got 3 different types of Beguiling mobs. You have an Emissary of the Tides, which basically makes the mobs CC immune and kick immune. You got Emissary of the Void, which does like a massive amount of AoE damage. It is like line of sightable, so you can actually dip in and out of line of sight in order to be able to not refresh like that dot that it puts on you. And then you have the Enchanted Emissary, which reflects all the damage that is inside the dome. You can knock back the Enchanted Emissary, so we're going to definitely see how people end up dealing with that today, and it'll definitely be interesting as a new seasonal affix.
Yeah, it'll definitely start changing around some of the routings. Of course, there are going to be specific weeks where one of those emissaries is going to be more dominant than another, so we're going to see a mix of those dungeons so far. Before we go into the dungeons, let's talk about the standings and what is on the line. We've already seen 2 teams qualify for BlizzCon here, both Method teams in Method EU, Method NA, as you're seeing outlined in gold right there, have qualified for BlizzCon by competing in the LAN in Australia here. So you're seeing that line, that's going to be the cutoff for those ranks, and see who is going to be, at the moment, in line to qualify for the BlizzCon tournament at the end of the year. But keep in mind, points are going to be increased by 50% right now. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities here, Sloot, for teams to step up, maybe have a little bit of chance of a little leapfrog going on.
Yeah, I mean, 50% is a lot, Jack. It's bigger than 40, as we've discussed
really?
backstage.
Wow.
But, you know, we talked about this backstage, too, and I mean, these teams, yeah, it's a big point bump, but if you're, you know, a reformed team or clawing from the bottom, you're going to have to do an amazing job cup after cup. You're going to have to win a few cups. You're going to have to hope that some of your competitors drop low. I mean, it's not that kind of cut and dry for it.
Yeah, and we'll have to be watching that. But of course, before we get into it, we'll have to look at the time trials to see where these guys have placed in the cup thus far, with Abrakeydabra coming in as that #1 seed, and we're also going to be seeing them first on the day. Method NA, EU, 40K all returning. We have a couple of different kind of combination teams as well, Nagura, with Pain for Femme, No Girls Allowed, being kind of reforms of other MDI teams, kind of merging themselves together for this new season.
Yeah, unfortunately, if you do a reform of your team, then of course you don't take any of the points from the first season with you, so therefore they have to start with 0, but with the point increase they can still manage to get a BlizzCon spot if they play really well. But yeah, we'll see how they do with the reforming of the group. You know, if they got the best players from 2 teams and put them into 1, maybe it's going to work out for them.
We'll have to start seeing as we take a look at our bracket, of course, for these guys coming up on today. So it will be double elimination, best of 3 coming out. And we've been talking a little bit about Abrakeydabra here, Sloot, how they're coming in as that #1 seed. So they'll have that first game coming up today.
And, you know, it's interesting with Abra. It's kind of a direct and indirect, you know, positive note to their team right now. You know, they're always hungry for that top spot in the previous season. They're gunning for it. They're doing as well as they can. They have that kind of small roster change as well. But on the flip side, you have the 2 Method teams, which were the 2 teams that were above Abra in the first place, and they're already qualified for BlizzCon. So I'm really curious to see if we're going to see a more relaxed version of the Method teams this season, allowing Abra to get to that top spot constantly, or if they're going to kind of battle for pride and seeding for BlizzCon.
Yep. Seeding for BlizzCon will be very important, but let's take a look at the schedule coming up today that we'll be looking at. Abra versus Syzygy to start us off, followed up by Pain for Femme and 40K, with Method NA versus Fly Me Out, Method EU versus No Girls Allowed, both of our upper semis, and we'll have those lower round eliminations to wrap up our day. So a lot of action going to be coming up, but when we start looking at Abrakeydabra, Sloot touched on it a little bit there, Nagura, there is a roster change coming up from them from last season.
Yeah, so if you can have 1 roster swap each time, so they're actually allowed to do that and keep their points. So they have Alstrad actually not playing with them anymore. It's going to be Smok this time, which was, you know, Alstrad just stepped out. He wasn't kicked or anything. He just didn't want to play anymore, didn't want to commit. So they replaced him with Smok, which is a very high profile, high Mythic Plus player who's been around for a long time. He's a streamer as as well. So, and he's also really good at multi-classing, so maybe we'll see something that is not a Rusty Druid.
I think also actually went to try and go pro league right now, if I'm not mistaken. So he's kind of moving to other games, so to speak.
Yeah, without a doubt. And it'd be interesting to start seeing if any kind of multi-classing comes in. I know in time trials early on, they were seeing a little bit of Monk play, but we'll have to see going forward as we take a look at our matchups to start off the day with Underrot, Shrine of the Storm, and if we go into 3 games, we'll go to Freehold. So Fortified, Raging, and Necrotic. What are you thinking about these affixes so far, Titles?
So Raging and Necrotic is definitely going to be interesting for Underrot, but in general, Underrot is actually a Tides Emissary heavy dungeon, and that can actually be very dangerous for Kragmaw's Room. Just how the teams end up going through Kragmaw's Room, making sure that they are able to separate out those Emissary of the Tides from all the packs to make sure that the mobs are kickable, because the Lashers and the Bloodswarmers and all of those other mobs do in fact need to be kicked. So how you end up running through that dungeon is going to be very interesting from these 2 teams.
We'll have to watch that, as we're also going to be taking a look at the different racials that these guys are going to be bringing into the table here. Salute a couple Night Elves as expected, but we also have a couple Dwarves coming in.
Kind of as expected too. We saw that in the previous season as well. You have rogues that can already vanish, and they have the DR, and they can take several debuffs off of themselves as a dwarf. So not too shocked to see that. Not too shocked to see the triple rogue action either. We do
well, I'm actually really sad because Syzygy was the one team that played Vengeance Demon Hunter.
But we might see it in the future. Stop spoiling. We all know now what's about to happen to Outlaw Rogues next week. But for now, Outlaw Rogues are about to dominate this map.
They will indeed, as we're starting up our Game 1 between Abrakeydabra and Syzygy to start off our summer season.
Great to see you here for the start of the summer season on the MDI. Title's kind of touched on it. Of all the dungeons we have here for the summer season, at least for this week right now, Underrot is probably the nastiest, or at least one of the nastiest.
Yeah, it's Raging, Necrotic, Fortified. So those are very difficult affixes, of course. And you can also vote on Twitch using hashtag Abra if you think Abra is going to win, and hashtag
SYZ.
There we go.
Or Z.
If you think they're going to win.
We have to work on our synergy. Teams are getting ready here. So now a couple of additions that you will notice to the UI from home. We do have actually cooldowns available on the party menus at the top, so you can kind of keep an eye on the players and what they do. Syzygy aggressively jumping right in there with that Emissary of the Tides, grabbing everything together. Keep in mind those Emissary of Tides, that kind of watery figure there representing Ashara. Prevent all mobs nearby from being not only crowd controlled, but you can't even interrupt their cast. So the priest bolts are going off, etc. Abrakeydabra starting to sneak by with a shroud initially, going down to that mask pack.
Yeah, so Abra is using their Bloodlust here on this very huge pull where they pull the Bridge Patrol into this platform area as well. They nuke down the mask first because the mask actually very dangerous, has a lot of difficult casts. And we also see one of the Blood Priests being blinded here in the back because those Blood Priests have a lot of dangerous casts that need to be interrupted as well. There's a lot of heals going on, a lot of Blood Bolts that need to be interrupted. So they just chose to succeed at the start to not have to deal with all of those interrupts at the very same time.
Syzygy doing their share of the trash at the top as they finish off a few of the ticks and now head down the ramp to the next Matron pack. Matron's extremely dangerous to remind those at home. Of course, they do that, have that AoE shout that increases casting and attack speed of all nearby enemies by 100%. Abrakeydabra, however, wasting no time. We don't have those 20% breakpoints anymore, waiting for Reaping to join the boss, so they get right down to business with Elder Liaxa already using that Spell Reflect right off the bat for Divine Field, getting as much chunk damage reflected back into the boss.
And of course, on Fortified, the Elder Liaxa shouldn't take them too long, but they still want to make sure they interrupt all of the casts properly so that tank doesn't flop, and they want to use their Spell Reflect properly as well. Most of the time, it's being used on the effigy to make sure that it's killed faster, to make it safer. But if you want to kill the boss faster, you actually want to use the Spell Reflect on the boss, just to make sure the boss goes down faster. But on Fortified, either way should be fine for both of those teams.
Indeed, and the teams, of course, do have quite substantial gear compared to what we're used to on live. They do have access to the 65 neck trait for the essences, so they not only have the major, but 2 minors available to them as well, including some high eye level. So some of these bosses shouldn't be as dangerous, especially in this fortified setting. We do know Liaxa can chunk with that Blood Bolt, but Abrakeydabra doing an excellent job to make sure not a single one leaks as they finish off the first boss first and head down the ramp. Liaxa only now getting started by Syzygy, who does have that 3% trash advantage, but Nagura, we know that's really not that much.
Yeah, definitely not a huge deal here, especially in this dungeon where you can make up so much trash, especially here in this area in the Kragma room. Usually we see teams deal with all of the trash in this room just because Kragma is a boss that will run around and aggro mobs if they haven't been killed before. We see Abrakeydabra dealing with one of the Tides emissaries here. Of course, the Living Rods don't have too many dangerous casts, and that's why they pulled it on top of the Tides emissary, because this Living Rod does not actually need to be interrupted. You just need to step out of it.
Just step out of it indeed as they kill off that first emissary. Now, important to note about these emissaries as well, once they reach 1 HP, they do actually start to channel a spell to port out of the dungeon as opposed to actually dying, and players can actually stun them before getting to that break point to prevent their cast entirely, because as they're casting, they still have their aura around them, making mobs not interruptible. So you want to make sure you're not pulling any of these emissary tides with too many of the mobs in Kragma's room, as we're seeing Abrakeydabra, of course, respecting that rule. They don't want to be able to CC and interrupt. You're not going to have any control on the Maggot, for instance, which we know does a huge amount of frontal.
Yeah, we see there's still 2 more Tides emissaries in this room as far as I can see from here. So they definitely got to be careful on how they do their pulls, because as you mentioned, with the Tide emissary you can't have any interrupts going out. So therefore you can't interrupt the Maggots and the Lashes that they're pulling right here. And there's no one who can actually dispel the Lasher's stun in case it's going through, because it's a disease. And there's no monks in Abrakeydabra's or Syzygy's setup here. So you don't have the Windwalker anymore or the Mistweaver. So you cannot actually dispel it. You have to heal the debuff away in case it goes through.
Or paladins or priests, okay, Nagura. There are other classes that can do it out there. Syzygy, of course, crowd controlling that emissary on the side. Important to note that the emissary of Tides crowd control tables follows PvP rules. It has shortened duration on everything, so usually 5 to 8 seconds depending on the spell, but does not have diminishing returns, so you can keep spamming roots on it, for instance. Something that Syzygy is doing well here with Kausho, making sure that the entangled roots are constantly active as they finish off the rest of the mobs. Abrakeydabra once again dealing with their own emissary of the Tides on the other end of the map. Everybody trying to clear Kragma's room as quickly as possible to get access to the second boss here.
Yeah, you can definitely tell that the Tides emissary is difficult to deal with because they're soloing it. Of course, soloing one mob costs you a lot of time. It's very inefficient, but because of this room just being so difficult, needing so many interrupts, they just can't pull it on top of any other trash mob. So therefore, they're just soloing it, even though they're going to lose a lot of time. But they probably tried pulling it on top of something else, and it just didn't work out. So they said, you know what, we're just going to play it safe and just finish it up by itself.
First death here, another death here, excuse me, as Syzygy's tank goes down. Immediate battle res comes up. Not going to be available again for 5 minutes, as that is 4 deaths on the tally for them. 20 seconds extra that they're going to have to overcome on this very dominant-looking Abrakeydabra team. And, of course, Switch Chat, the surprises don't end there. Not only have we added cooldowns on the UI, but we now have squad streaming available. So if there's a team that you're particularly interested in viewing on a full-screen mode, you can actually head over and watch the Warcraft stream in squad mode and choose the respective team, of course, with full audio to both sides that you want to follow instead. So check that out if you feel like it. Syzygy now moving past the room, grabbing some more trash, including some of the dangerous skeleton packs beyond the second boss's room, as Abrakeydabra doing a quite sizable pull here, Nagura.
Yeah, it's a pretty big pull coming out of Abrakeydabra. You can, keep an eye on those cooldowns, on those defensives and offensives being used underneath the party frames here on the top to make sure you can see the rogues rotating their cooldowns. Of course, if you have 3 rogues, you don't want to use all of their cooldowns at the very same time because you want to constantly pull bigger pulls. So therefore, you can see on top how they rotate their cooldowns in between the 3 rogues. And of course, we see Smok is doing a lot of damage in cat form as well, as he's jumping in and out, just spamming that swipe.
More trouble here for the warrior on Syzygy as Knight goes down yet again. Keep in mind, of course, we are not only in a necrotic affix, but we have raging as well. So immense danger to the tanks if they wait too long to kite out of the pack. If those necrotic stacks get too high, preventing incoming healing, and you have enraged mobs sub 30% doing 100% increased damage, it's gonna spell doom for your tank, which we've seen twice already over on the side of Syzygy, as they once again recollect themselves and pull some more trash, dealing with what the first, I believe, enchanted emissary that we've seen in this dungeon. Of course, we saw it earlier for Abrakeydabra, but let's put that one on hold. We'll chat in a moment. I have a feeling we'll see several more emissaries throughout this season, as Kragma is now down to 2/3 HP for Abra.
Yeah, Kragma still a difficult boss, even on a fortified setting. Of course, you need to make sure that you soak all those blood pools on the floor so you don't have the maggots spawn out of it, because not only are the maggots putting a bleeding effect that stacks on whoever it is targeting, but you also have necrotic, which makes it way more difficult. Also on this AoE, as you can see, the tantrum happening right now, everyone running around. But again, rogues they are very mobile, so they should be able to get all of them here.
I didn't realize there are any rogues on any of these teams, but apparently there are, as Abracadabra's rogues indeed jump around, making sure to soak all the ticks. Unfortunately, one did leak. Could be a bit dangerous for the tank. That is an extra set of, I suppose, little tendrils that give you necrotic on the tank, so they make sure to finish that off quickly before it gets too out of hand for Divine Field, who can, of course, at least leap away from the boss's frontal to make sure that he does not get hit by that indigestion, which does a huge amount of shadow damage. Syzygy still holding their own right now as they seem to be clearing the last of the trash here in Kragma's room before getting ready to pull, falling just further and further behind Abra. A very well-practiced Abra team, might I add, at this point, who is now at 59% trash, has finished off the second boss versus Syzygy's 55% on the trash and only now starting the boss.
Yeah, this is very important to Abra this whole season in general, because of course they are not qualified for BlizzCon yet. They were their third spot, so it very much matters the kind of seeding they get on each cup, because the higher seeding, the more points they get, and they need to qualify for that BlizzCon spot, and therefore they of course need to make sure they play every game and every cup on top of their game, and they're doing really well so far. This is the very first very first map of the whole season, and they don't have any deaths. They have really clean runs so far, so good job by Abrakeydabra here so far.
Huge amounts of damage coming in from the rogues on Abrakedabra's side, just absolutely annihilating the trash here. Of course, unfortunately, at the bottom of the meter, we do see the once powerful Prot Warrior. We do know, of course, their AoE prowess and damage has been pretty substantially nerfed since last season, which is why we don't see them doing as much, but nothing else was touched for Prot Warriors. They're still an excellent tank, very durable, and have that spell reflect and further utility, which is why they're going to be another popular choice yet again this season. Abrakeydabra now 67% as they've dealt with the tides on the side and are now dealing with one of these danger noodles right now. One of the casts, unfortunately, does go off on the group, chunks them low, but no danger for Smog, who starts to hot everybody back up.
Yeah, so this curse that gets applied if the cast goes through actually reduces your damage done, and Smog dispelled Ashine, so now we know Smog likes Ashine more than Dr. J and Swag.
I mean, that's just, we're not supposed to have any bias here towards it, but I would have chosen Ashine myself instead of Dr. J. Abrakeydabra here getting ready to pull the third boss as they deal with the double Defiler pack. Now, this is a particularly nasty pack. These Defilers require a 2-interrupt rotation, not only for their Shadow Bolt volley, but also the Withering Curse that Nagura had mentioned earlier. So you need to have a tank and a rogue, and then the other 2 rogues assigned to each of these 2 Defilers to kick properly. Of course, the totem we don't care about, we just move away from it. But we have that Emissary of Tides in the pack as well, which you can see they respected, and they just rooted in the corner to make sure that they don't prevent interrupts on these Defilers. So it certainly slows everything down a bit.
Yeah, and you also, of course, we didn't mention Raging too much yet, but Raging also a pretty difficult affix to deal with, especially with those mobs that need to be undrafted all the time, because sometimes if a cast goes through on a mob, you might not immediately die, but if the mob is Raging, you definitely are going to die, so it's even more crucial that you interrupt those mobs once they are Raging, and when you do those really huge pulls, you want to make sure that the tank is, of course, hiding, especially because he probably has a lot of necrotic stacks, because, they were incumbent for a long time once the mobs are below 30%, and then you also have the Raging. So this combination of affixes is actually very dangerous, on top of Fortified too.
Return here to Spore Caller Zansha, our favorite mushroom boss. The third boss of the dungeon, of course. You just want to make sure that you're deleting or eliminating all these mushrooms as much as possible before he does his Festering Harvest cast at 100 energy. As we've all seen many times, of course, you can use that upheaval on the side. Somebody can run through the mushrooms, or the tank needs to point the boss with the shockwave and make sure that those mushrooms are eliminated in order to not get a dot on the raid. Now, important, we actually mentioned this earlier as well. This boss, you kind of had that safety net before. Somebody could go, oh no, we forgot to go a couple mushrooms and we run through. It's okay, the monk can dispel. So there's no dispels here. So the rogues would have to commit their Cloak of Shadows. We can see only Dr. J and Swagstep have their cloaks available at this point on Zansha right now. So they have to be really good with the mushroom play as to not commit those very powerful cooldowns from the rogues just for that nature.
But the boss is just dying so fast. They probably don't even need their cloaks anymore. As you can see, just the boss already in 20%. You can see the damage meter on the top left. Just the rogue is doing so much single target damage. And also Smog just not having to deal with too much healing here on this fortified setting. So even the healer can do a lot of damage, almost as much as Divine Field here on the Prot Warrior. And after this boss, they don't have too much trash left. They only have 22% left. Only one more Reaping Wave, of course, to deal with. And then they're on the last boss.
One more Reaping Wave.
Yeah.
But Reaping, of course, is a thing of the past, so we won't be seeing any of that right now. Now, Syzygy actually opted to skip skip most of the trash leading up to Zansha and actually pull the 2 Defilers on top of the boss, which is very dangerous. The Emissary is now there as they've killed the Defilers. The tank's getting really low, though, as is one of the rogues, Kithis, right now, but managed to heal up from Kosho and start to stabilize, but it's going to be very hard to drop those necrotic stacks until a Festering Harvest cast comes in for Syzygy right there, so we'll have to keep an eye on them. The tank's already had a few struggles falling over to that Raging Necrotic combo. Abrakeydabra doing a fairly sizable pull here with the Defiler, grabbing the Guardians in on top of that Hazard Spaghetti and making sure that they interrupt it properly as not to get any of those Death Bolt casts onto the raid.
Yeah, you actually saw them charge into that emissary of Tides and nuke it down without rooting it first, just to be faster here. Now those Guardians, they don't have that many casts that needs to be interrupted. The only difficult thing is the Death Speaker that they pulled on top. Now sometimes it casts a Wicked Frenzy, which can only be interrupted by stuns, and of course with the Tides emissary there, it's not interruptible. But even if the cast goes through, then it's an Enrage and a random Guardian, which Smok can dispel, and with Soothe. So they definitely managed to do that well.
Interesting pull here from Abra as well. Not exactly the most aggressive pull we've seen from them. They do have to deal with this Corruptor and one of those Hazard Spaghettis right now, after which they'll only need the remaining 2 Corruptors outside the gate to the final boss. You do have to complete that 100% trash before it, and they'll likely have to pull one of those Spaghettis on top of it. But, from a team like Abra, I'm kind of curious as to why you only pull 2 mobs at once. I know you're kind of rooted in place with those heads, but I'm shocked that they didn't pull something else in the dungeon, knowing them. Emissary of Tides in here as well. Of course, prevents all interrupts and CCs on these Corruptors, but the Corruptors really have no interruptible casts anyways, and you don't have a displace in the group except maybe that Typhoon for the Corruptors, but it's easy to just dodge their frontal nonetheless.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that how much their routing changed as well compared to the Reaping affix on the last season, as we've seen Underrot quite a lot. But this time around, Abrakeydabra is pulling a lot more of those danger macaronis as they did last time around. We've seen most teams skip them because they're such a pain to deal with because they're not movable. You see Ashan actually proc the Cheat Death here as he probably got hit by one of those tentacle swings here. But of course, Cheat Death preventing him from dying here. And again, just those danger noodles, just very annoying to deal with just because they can't be moved and they constantly need to be interrupted. So interesting to see that they're pulling them here.
They're menacing macaronis.
I'm sorry.
Not danger macaronis. All right, Negro. Got to talk about this before. Abrakeydabra dominantly heading down to the last boss right now. Of course, this time there will not be any Reaping joining them as we're used to seeing in the previous season. They are just ready to pull the boss immediately and start kiting around in a circular fashion as we're used to seeing from these teams, making sure that the breath is not pointed in the direction that they go. Get the boss to 100 energy 3 times over, spawns 2 adds every time. Each add does a 1/6 of the boss's health, which is why the boss's health is not moving right now. Syzygy, still trying to play catch-up right now. They're only 82% trash on the board, and they are at the end of the dungeon as well, right outside the 4th boss's area. Another death goes down, unfortunately, from one of the rogues as the immediate battle res goes up. Not going to have that one available again for 5 minutes, but, they have a lot of trash to make up here, Nagura.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I'm not sure if they miscalculated or if that's actually their plan because, I assume they practiced this dungeon because it's the very first one, so I'd very highly assume they did so. So this has to be planned by them to just go all the way to that Tide Emissary first and then backtrack. I have to question this strategy because, we all know backtracking is not something you want to do in a speed run in a dungeon. So interesting to see or to know why they chose to do this kind of strategy where they just backtrack afterwards.
Yeah, going faster is oftentimes faster than going forward is oftentimes faster than going backwards here. Another huge chunk on the group here for Syzygy as they've done a fairly aggressive pull here. The mobs are raging right now, and Knight does keep stacking those necrotic. But right now, all eyes on Abrakeydabra as the boss is now 32% health. They keep riding around in the circle, and they are getting ready to spawn the last group of small adds. Of course, the construct in the middle will assist by killing them off as well.
Yeah, and then the last boss here, we see Abrakeydabra not really having trouble here at all. I do remember last time around, they actually did have Elstrad die on this last boss, and they almost wiped it off because there's sometimes those spores, they sometimes like to spawn on top of players, and they like to one-shot you. But on a 45 setting, you should even be able to survive one of those spores, so it shouldn't be a problem for them here as they finish up the first dungeon.
Abrakeydabra taking a very convincing game 1 against Syzygy on the Underrot there. Very good job by them, and it seems like they've really been pulling through even with that new healer edition there, Tattles.
Yeah, it seems like they've actually just put in an insane amount of practice and just an amount of time. I know that we've actually saw some of them doing their time trial runs as something that has changed. A lot of teams are looking to stream their time trial stuff not streaming practice, but just Abrakeedabra's amount of time and effort that they've actually been putting into all these dungeons definitely shows here. And you can actually see that. You actually see Divine here jumping into this big mask pack, doing this huge pull on the opener, them using Bloodlust. Like this has to be such like a heavily practiced pull just to be able to do. And then from this point forward, they end up just dealing with Kragmaw's room super well. And overall, this is like a super clean run. They end up downing Kragmaw, and then they make their way onto Sporecaller Zancha about at the same time that Syzygy is actually downing Kragmaw here. So you're going to see Syzygy killing Kragmaw, and then at the exact same moment, Abra is already on Sporecaller, using that Emissary of the Tides and pulling it straight into the boss. And then just overall, Abra just ended up having just a super clean run in a dungeon that can actually just cause so many issues, especially on this new Beguiling affix. And it's really good to see how they were able to clean up some of the issues, because I know last season we had some questions as to the consistency of Abrakeydabra. So if they can actually keep this up with this super clean play from them, I expect to see very good things out of the team Abrakeydabra.
Yeah, that's one of the things we've kind of talked about a couple times, Salute, is in many cases, Abra was that kind of tale of two teams where they had on paper, they were that veteran team, tons of MDI experience, and then sometimes they'd go into the tournaments and just not really do so well. So strong performance by them in game one.
Yeah, their kind of story last season was they were their worst enemies. They would have just dominant performances, and then they would just kind of throw maps or games once in a while. They would beat themselves up. They would just throw leads even against Method NA and Method EU sometimes as well last season. So, solid start from them, but we're going to need to see the consistency coming out of them throughout the rest of the Cup this weekend and in future weekends to see if they've kind of managed to overcome that nightmare.
Yep, and one of the big nightmares that is in Underrot, especially there, Tettles, is Kragmaw's room. And as you mentioned before, having the Tides Emissary up this week has caused a lot of problems for teams.
Yeah, it can definitely be a super big kryptonite for teams. And as we actually do see in this highlight clip here, you actually see how Abrakeydabra ends up CCing that Emissary of the Tides. So first off, they open up with a sap, which will be an 8-second sap on that mob. And then you actually do see Zmok here rooting that Emissary of the Tides off to the side to make sure that it doesn't get into this pack, because you actually have to make sure that the maggot is CC'd. You have kicks on the Blood Swarmers. You have to make sure that those reanimated Guardians sometimes get stunned, and just making sure that Divine ends up being healthy over the course of the whole entire pull will actually be very important. And then as we did see in the highlight clip as well, they end up using that Emissary of the Tides and pulling it into Kragmaw just to make sure that they do have efficient cleave, because you don't end up needing to kick Kragmaw. There's no real reason for that. So there's no danger in actually pulling it into the boss. So they just end up dealing with that room excellently, and then they actually just make sure that they pull pretty far ahead just because of how they end up dealing with the rune.
Yeah, they also did that for Sporecaller Zancha as well, and that was also a very difficult pack as they had any of those caster mobs. I think it was one of the Defiler casts that is so annoying, and it's just pulsing so much damage onto the group if you're leaving it uninterrupted. So it kind of shows how a lot of the Beguiling mobs here in Nagura can easily be dealt with by one or two people in many cases, but it requires a lot of maintenance to be able to do it.
Definitely, and a lot of planning ahead too, of course. We saw the CCs come out, and we saw the planning around where they would CC the Emissary of Tides and then pull it on top of the boss, because of course on bosses where you don't need to interrupt anything, it doesn't really do anything. Of course, Zancha does do a lot of tank damage as far as I'm aware, so having the Tides on top, but on a fortified setting, it shouldn't really be a big deal at all. And of course, also the Emissaries are not affected by any other affixes at all, so it's not a problem to pull it on top of bosses, and they handled it really well.
With ease there. So Abrakeydabra having a magical beginning, but they need to be able to win another one to keep moving on into the upper brackets. I'm sure they want to. So don't go anywhere. The MDI will return right after this. Welcome back to the Mythic Dungeon International here, as Abrakeydabra is up 1 against Syzygy. And now it's all on the line in this season to get that qualification for BlizzCon. So if you'd like to support WoW Esports and help boost up that big old prize pool, be sure to check out the Horde or Alliance Fireworks or the Transmorpher Beacon, as proceeds will go on into the prize pool at the end of the year. So with Abra up 1, they're going on into Shrine of the Storm here. And with the new season that we had coming around here, Tettles, there's been a lot of rebalancing in these dungeons in terms of trash count and some adjustments to tuning for some of these mobs.
Yeah, so one of the major changes in all of the dungeons is to Shrine of the Storm. They made the mini bosses in Shrine of the Storm, like Windspeaker Heldis and the Rune Carver and all, and like the aqua elemental thing that's
Aquaman.
I don't know what it's actually. The living current. The living
it's
current at the
Aquaman.
very beginning of the instance. They made them all give a little bit more count. They made the eels towards the end of the dungeon give a little bit less. So they made it significantly harder for you to get full count without actually doing the dungeon with the mini bosses. In addition to that, we actually do have teaming, as you can actually see as well. So I know that it's very, very difficult for you to get count without doing like a large amount of the portions of the trash in this instance, since that count rebalance plus just how difficult teaming can be sometimes.
Yeah, we'll have to watch in on that, as you mentioned, having to deal with the mini bosses. That's one thing we've seen a lot of times here in Nagura. Teams are just skipping at all costs, and they've been optimizing their strategy towards skipping it around.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting
Whoa,
to see.
whoa, whoa.
Wow.
Everybody
We're getting the Vengeance Demon Hunter here for Syzygy. This is something we saw a little bit out of them in time trials, but after seeing that game once, I wasn't sure if they're going to run with it.
I mean, yeah, you know, Vengeance is it's a spec, and it has a lot of potential. It really does. Just because of the essence system right now, you get a lot of popular, an upcoming popular build right now with Visions and Gluttony. And I'm not sure if he's going to be running it here. We'll have to see. Our tool, of course, has not updated just yet. But perhaps this is his comfort pick. Maybe the Protware is just not what works for Knight right now. So hoping to see some good things out of this, especially with that AoE silent sigil in a dungeon like Shrine.
So many kicks required as they go into game 2. Syzygy fighting to stay in this matchup as we go into Shrine of the Storm.
Abra starting off here versus Team Team Syzygy here on the right side right now, getting ready, pulling. Now, on this dungeon, we haven't mentioned Agur as well. This is an arcane-heavy dungeon for emissaries. So, of course, those arcane adds, we see several of them around the area right now on Syzygy's side. They will, anything within that bubble will reflect 200% of damage done.
Yeah, so the Arcane Emissary usually not too difficult to deal with because it will get knocked back if you do any sort of damage to it. And of course, Resto Druids, you know, they have those instant dots like Moonfire or Sunfire they can just constantly cast on that mob. Of course, if they have to heal at the same time, then it's going to be difficult, but you also have other abilities to deal with it, like Vortex, for example. And you can also use other CC on it to make sure it's not going to be on top of your trash that you're killing currently. Now, Abrakeydabra did this like very typical dungeon pull that we've seen from last season, where the tank will make sure that he gathers all the mobs, and some of them will be tricked by the rogues on top of the tank, and then the Eventful just jumps on the lantern, as you can see right there, and then all of the mobs will snap. Now, the problem with the snapping ability that lots of those teams have been abusing in the past is that sometimes it will not work as they are planned to, and some of them will reset. And if they reset, they will also reset their aggro, and they might just kill some of the melees around. So definitely not as easy to deal with this snapping mechanic because there's definitely things that can go wrong as well.
Yes, we see here Syzygy chewing through a lot of healing done from that Vengeance Demon Hunter. One of the strengths, of course, of Vengeance Demon Hunter is their prowess to self-sustain and also high HP pool. Now, looking over at our tool, of course, our kind of talent tool here with the Wowhead, powered by Wowhead, we do see that he's actually opting to run a more traditional build. So he has that Spirit Bomb along with actually an Anima on his Essence. Just because of their high health, it allows him to get even more nuke damage on a 2-minute timer on the ads. So still susceptible to that spike damage as a result of not running the Gluttony along with Visions, but hopefully it works out for them. It is something that they're comfortable with and use it for time trials, and you can see just some of the strengths, at least the meter strengths of that Vengeance Demon Hunter coming in. We'll have to see how it goes for the rest of the map, but Abrakeydabra, once again, just so well practiced, starting to pull ahead right into that first bosses, one of the best designed bosses in the world's room right now, getting in, getting some of the trash as the role playing, the RP has started for the encounter, and then they will get ready to tackle down Akusir.
I think I have to disagree on best designed boss here, but let's move on as Swag
I would
said
too if I get knocked off the platform all the time.
Swagset did run ahead and make sure that he starts the RP on this boss because Aquasir does not immediately spawn. You need to make sure you walk there to start the RP, and then we'll spawn a little bit afterwards. That's why Swag ran there, and the rest of the team made sure they pulled the trash in the meantime. And now that Aquasir actually spawned, they did engage the boss, use their Bloodlust, and they have to deal with some of the spiritualists here that are still alive.
Yeah, Spiritualist, a lot of casts. We have those Mending Rapids as well that you want to make sure you're interrupted is a pretty substantial heal plus a healing over time component to a fellow enemy mob nearby. So you want to make sure that's not happening. Aquasir rapidly approaching 50% for Abrakeydabra right now, where he will split into 3 Aqualings in an equilateral triangle along the circular platform that will have surges in various directions that can, of course, knock you off the platform, Nagura.
Yeah, that never happened to me, so I don't know what you're talking about. As Syzygy actually is doing a lot of damage on the boss here, and they're progressing pretty fast, very close to Abrakeydabra. If you look at the percentage, trash percentage, Syzygy is a little bit behind, but they have a lot of trash to kill here. As you can see, all of the trash running around. This is a very dangerous pull. I believe they also pulled minibus. Yeah, they pulled the minibus on top of Aquaseer, so definitely very dangerous pull here coming out of Syzygy.
Yeah, Windspeaker Heldis, of course, quite dangerous in that pack. Does drop that kind of rune of quickening on the ground that increases your haste by 25% for not only you, but any enemy standing within it as well. So they're trying to use that to their advantage right now. But he pulses an immense amount of AoE damage right now as Kilth procs cheat death, as does Rubik. Knight just gets so low, but manages to hang on. The group is once again healed up as they spread out for Quaking. Now, of course, here we are in a Quaking and teaming environment. So just a bit of error on the screen right now. And we have Tyrannical, meaning the bosses are a bit more dangerous. So just keep that in mind as we saw the team spread there for the Quaking with more mobs on top of the boss for teaming right now. Aquaseer getting down to that 50% soon as Abrakeydabra waits for him to re-emerge. Does reach that 10%-ish, 15% once you eliminate the 3 Aqualings and you finish off the boss.
Yeah. So this is a Tyrannical setting, right? This boss can be very dangerous on Tyrannical just because this intermission phase, there's so much damage and there's so many other casts you need to deal with on top of this surging rush that can knock you off the platform, of course. So interesting to see that Syzygy is actually pulling this mini boss on top of Aquaseer, which I assume was intentional because we mentioned before that on in Shrine of the Storm, it's very difficult to get the 100% count now with the trash percent changes and also teaming, because in case you guys don't know, teaming actually makes so that each mob gives less mob count because there's more mobs in the dungeon. So therefore in this dungeon it's very difficult to get that 100%, and therefore the teams need to pull a lot of those trash mobs, including some of those mini bosses, as you can see in Abracadabra's side here as well.
Yeah, I believe Soren has been pulled on the side as we do have one of the arcane emissaries. This is an arcane rich dungeon in terms of assignment for the teams in the tournament this week, so it has been punted off to the side. You want to make sure that it's just kept away as its energy bar depletes over the course of 20 seconds, and once it does that, it will then teleport out of the dungeon. So that's why any kind of direct damage, even let's say a Rushing Jade Wind, should there be a Brewmaster in here, does constantly punt the mob away, so somebody kind of has to babysit it and make sure it does not reach the pack. It is also movable by things like Ring of Peace, or you can stun it, but you can't hard CC it, so no saps, no roots on it, etc. You do have to constantly get it out of the way over the course of those 20 seconds. Syzygy finally catching up right now as Aquaseer reaches 8%, but once again, they're just starting to fall further and further behind. We're seeing the same kind of trend here from the previous dungeon already. Abrakeydabra just so well practiced. They're really gunning for that top spot, Nagura. And I mean, Syzygy, squeaking in one of the lower brackets, they made it to time trials this week, but for teams that are trying to catch up from the bottom to get to BlizzCon, you really have to outperform a team like Abrakeydabra, which is no small feat.
Yeah, it's definitely really difficult for those kind of teams like Syzygy to make sure they catch up with the rest of the teams. They're just so well practiced, so much experience, especially in Abrakeydabra, as you have the winners from last year, right? You have Divine Field and Ashine here, and you have Dr. J, who's been doing dungeons for I don't know how long, so much experience in the MDI as well. So very difficult for Syzygy to keep up with Abrakeydabra here, as they just have such a clean run here again. Just like in their underup before, 0 deaths, everything working out really well. As Syzygy, of course, their strategy is working out well too. They only had 1 death so far, which I believe was a rogue that just now died, but they battle rest him up immediately. But I think it's just their strategy that is a little bit too slow.
Yeah, strategy is too slow. Abrakeydabra is just combining things very effectively and very aggressively as well. We can see now the Guardian Elemental does get skipped as in previous weeks, as the Rogues cheekily kind of hook shot over the side of the bridge there to make sure they get away. Divine Field runs over. Did they not? Oh no, they actually, they messed up their skip indeed. He comes in right now. Divine Field tried to use that Shadow Meld. We see the cooldown running at the top of the screen right now, but it just did not work out. So they're going to have to commit to killing this Guardian Elemental, which not only deals an immense amount of damage, you just saw how much pulse damage there was even in a Tyrannical setting, so the trash is not powered, but it just takes so long to kill, and they're not combining it with anything. This is the first slip-up we've really seen from them so far, Nagura.
Yeah, I think it was one of the Rogues who aggroed the patrol, and then the Shadow Meld timing was off, and then someone of them was in combat. But you can see this elemental, this storm that the elemental is casting, this mini boss, can actually be line of sighted to make sure you don't get any of the damage. But of course, with a full melee lineup, if you constantly have to line of sight, you're not going to be able to kill it. And therefore, they have to take this damage. But on top of the quaking, there's just so much damage on the whole array. You can see Smog's struggling to keep everyone alive, doing almost 40k HPS here to make sure everyone stays alive. But they did manage now, so they can move on soon. But it did cost them a lot of time.
Syzygy doing the exact same skip right now as they dominated the trash right before, wasting no time. Knight goes into a very aggressive pull as the Infernal strikes over to grab some more trash, gets some of those sigils down, gets his dots damage over time rolling on the mobs, and just combines everything. A lot of healing over, a lot of HPS coming out of that Vengeance Demon Hunter, allowing the Druid to focus on either some damage or supporting the rest of the team, because we do see there are some Tempests going left and right now, which do a pretty substantial amount of damage if you don't move out of the way, not to mention the quaking on top of it. Abrakeydabra does respond as well with a pretty significant pull of theirs as they grab all the initiates and aggressively grab them on top of the second boss, the Council boss, consisting of Brother Ironhull and Gale Caller Faye.
Yeah, this can be pretty dangerous now because as we assumed, this mini boss pull was actually a mistake. And as you can see with the cooldowns below the party frames, they had to use a lot of defensives and a lot of cooldowns to make sure they're dealing with this mini boss. So therefore, the next pulls, they don't have those cooldowns available to them anymore as they do in their usual strategy if everything works as planned. But this pull worked out for them. They only have to deal with some of the apprentices here and with the boss, of course, which is tyrannical, right? So it's still difficult to deal with.
You can see Divine Field respecting just how much damage intake comes from those Ironhull apprentices, along with Brother Ironhull himself. He has no shield wall available, no defensives available. Last Stand should be up soon. He doesn't even have Ironbark available from Smog right now, so he has to play it a bit safe, especially when those runes go down. Last thing you need right now is a tank Gib, especially on a Council boss right now. Now, Warrior fortunate enough to have that Heroic Leap, which does reset taunt, so he'd be able to grab both mobs relatively quickly if he goes down, but last thing you want is a tank death on a boss. And, following suit right now, Syzygy took advantage of that skip that failed for Abrakeydabra, did everything perfectly downstairs, and is right on the heels of Abra. Still slightly behind, and they still do have that one death on the board, Nagura.
Yeah, they do have the 10% difference in trash, but on a tyrannical setting, trash, of course, not a big deal, and 10% can be accounted for very quickly. Now, Abrakeydabra, they actually choose to interrupt a lot of those casts on Gale Caller Faye. In the past, in the first season of the MDI this year, we've seen the strategy where they would not interrupt the Slicing Blast whenever she has the buff up, because if you interrupt while she has the buff up on full energy, she will actually spawn those tornadoes, those tempests, as you can see throughout the room. And those tornadoes are just very dangerous for a full melee lineup like theirs, and it also costs you damage because sometimes you need to dodge around, you need to look out for it, just reducing your damage slightly. So interesting to see that Abrakeydabra actually chooses to interrupt some of those Slicing Blasts and actually getting those tornadoes in the room.
Indeed, as Brother Ironhull finally moves out of that last rune that he puts down, Gale Caller Faye has fallen here for Abrakeydabra. Along with Syzygy on the left, they're 18% behind the boss versus Abrakeydabra, and still that 10% trash that Nagura mentioned. But, we do have that teaming environment, so that is a fair bit of trash to cover, but it's something you can cover in a huge combined manner. A bit dangerous, though. Coming up are those Enforcers, and we know just how heavily they can hit on the tank, especially when combining him with some of the Ritualists on the side that need babysitting in terms of interrupts. They're doing well to spread out here for the quaking on both sides as Abrakeydabra enters the final 20% of Brother Ironhull and looks to finish off the fight before moving over to the Enforcer area. Now, I'm be curious to see here, Nagura, traditionally, as we saw last season, they would just kind of skip all the Enforcers, skip most of the bridge, do maybe one pack on the bridge, and then get their 80%, which is what was needed before. But now they need even more percent than that before the final Eel room with Vikoth.
Yeah, because they removed the percentage you gain from those eels in the very last room. Of course, those eels were something very easy to pull at the very end, and they gave so much percentage that I think it was 20% approximately that it gave, right? So, it was very easy to deal with them in the end because you could just kite them, run around, just AoE them down. And this trash here that they have to deal with now, as you can see in Abrakedabra's side of the screen, is way more dangerous to deal with, as you have those Enforcers and, of course, the Emissaries and the Ritualists that need to be interrupted constantly. And you can see Divine Field is not even tanking those mobs just because they do too much damage for him to be able to tank them. Of course, the 3 rogues are going to help here because Divine Field is not going to be able to do any damage, but they do have the tricks all the time to be able that Divine Field keeps the aggro.
Yeah, I mean, he did his damage, as you can see, a pretty substantial amount of damage with Avatar pop, everything pop, going in there and just getting what he can done. Now, they have to deal with a Void-Touched Emissary, or actually, they don't want to deal with the Void-Touched Emissary. That is, of course, an immobile mob that pulses very heavy AoE on a cast timer. So they just say, you know what, I don't want to deal with this. They go right up, and we see a more traditional skip from Season 2 here as everybody just Shadow Melds off. You can see that Shadow Meld CD now running at the top of the screen for Zmok and, of course, Divine Field. The rogues that did just use their Vanish as they got up. Now, a bit of trash that they'll have to deal with here before moving on to the third boss and then the fourth boss's room as well. You can see some of the marks coming up on those depth bringers. Very dangerous with their not only Void Bolt casts, but we will see Rip Mine go off on the tank, which does a heavy amount of tank damage, Shadow, and decreases your max health by 10%. So you really want to babysit that.
Yeah, those tentacles, of course, can't be moved, so Divine Field can't just leap away and make sure to kite those mobs, because if he does so, then the tentacles will actually AoE or hit anyone else. So a very dangerous pull here coming up. And also with teaming, you can see those patrols on the bridge actually have more mobs to them, and they're already dangerous in a non-teaming environment. So definitely dangerous pulls here, and everything needs to work out. Each interrupt, each stun needs to be perfectly synergized beforehand.
Lots of damage coming in here on Syzygy as we see meta popped in on the Vengeance Demon Hunter. Does have Anima, does scale with meta. The highest health unit of all the tanks right now is a Vengeance Demon Hunter. So with meta popped at this gear level, he's reaching well from 900k to maybe 1,000,000 HP. So using that Anima is a massive hit for all the mobs, which is why you see him at the top of the damage meters right now versus the 3 rogues for Syzygy's side. They finally aggressively deal with the rest of the Enforcer trash, and they'll get ready to move to the bridge themselves. But just further and further behind, they're going to need a full team wipe here from Abra in order to be able to catch up on this dungeon. Abra's just looking so dominant and composed compared to some of the shaky games we saw them with last season.
Yeah, definitely. But one thing to mention, though, is this Vengeance Demon Hunter's damage. I've looked to the damage meters of Syzygy's side here, and the Vengeance Demon Hunter is just doing so much damage. As you can see, doing more damage than 2 of the rogues here on one of those AoE pulls. So definitely one thing to note here for the Vengeance Demon Hunter. But again, as you mentioned, they're just behind at this point. The thing for them, though, is that they played a lot cleaner than their Underrot, right? In the Underrot, they had a couple of deaths. They were at the end of the dungeon with still 20% trash left. While in this shrine, it seems like they're a lot more practiced here, and they only have this one death from the rogue coming in earlier, so definitely a clean run for them. Just their strategy less efficient and slower compared to Abrakeydabra.
Slower indeed, as Lord Stormsong here is at 65% health. Team doing well to move around these purple balls and make sure they're not getting hit by them. Not only does it nuke you for a pretty substantial amount of damage, as we know, but does give you that significant duration of a stun. Team spreading out here for the Quaking as they recombine and make sure to move as a group. Syzygy now dealing with some of the last trash after the bridge in the same room as Abrakeydabra, but of course 12% behind on trash and half a boss at this point too. Their second death of the dungeon unfortunately goes down on Silk, one of the rogues. They are not committing the battle res to it right now as an AoE grip with Sigil of Chains comes in from the Demon Hunter, making sure not only to interrupt some of the ads, but buy him some time to kite. One of Vengeance Demon Hunter's weaknesses is that they do not have a natural slow. Rubik unfortunately going down as well on the side of Syzygy, and they're now trying to 3-man the rest of the trash, but a battle res does come up for Rubik as they try to kill the rest of the trash right now, slowly backpedaling and kiting around in a circle to move away from the frontals as we get Consume Magics coming out of the Demon Hunter too to make sure that they get some of those bubbles off and then mobs die faster.
Unfortunately, the caster curse struck again, and as I said, Syzygy was doing well. They have 3 deaths coming in on this pull here, but they should be able to recover and finish off this pull and then get the Mass Rest up on their rogue, as Abrakeydabra is about to finish off Lord Stormsong here. And as you can look at the percentage, the trash percentage, they're at 89%. And as we mentioned before, last season, they only needed 80% at this point of the dungeon. So definitely a big difference here compared to last time around.
Big difference indeed. Lord Stormsong about to fall now. Let's see if they make the old rookie mistake of jumping in the water before that lightning storm kind of phase. We've seen some cheat deaths proc from that in previous season. Actually, some people died even to that. Yeah. They're a bit overzealous, but this time they jump in, and hopefully nobody embarrassingly snapshotted forever on the internet gets hit by a jellyfish and stunned for 8 seconds. I know our observers are going to be very keen to find out if anybody has that happen to them. They spread out well here for that Quaking and do well so far to dodge these very evil jellyfish. Syzygy now moving over to Lord Stormsong as well. Zmonk with that absolutely horrid form of aquatic form, not using the dolphin form, just absolutely terrible.
It's so beautiful. I don't know what you're on about. But I do use the dolphin form myself, as it is so pretty. Now, Abrakeydabra do have to deal with some of those eel packs, and you can see the emissary, the enchanted emissary here as well, that of course is getting dealt with by the rogues and by Zmok himself to be able to keep it away from the eels as they pull, I believe, 2 packs together. And Divine Field just trying to kite, not getting hit by them, because those eels are put a debuff on the tank that stacks and it does shadow damage, so it does definitely a lot of damage to the tank, as they also pull a boss and the eels are stuck.
I mean, at an ealing, that was going to be a pretty substantial pull there, but not only does that shadow debuff go on the tank, Nagura, but it actually goes on the closest member if the tank is not within range. So you saw how respectful the rogues were of that, and they stayed away from the mobs as they came towards Volzith, the final boss of the dungeon. Now, we're going to probably see the typical thing that we've seen in the previous season from this. We're going to have the tank and the healer go to their own phase, the 3 DPS go to their own phase. Everybody's going to deal with their mobs, and then they're going to double back and deal with these denizens on the side, the trash during the boss, as Mach gets his 9 stack of the debuff, doing that increased damage, after which they will return and pop Bloodlust and try to one-phase the boss and finish him off before another transition.
Yeah, of course, Mach having this debuff, as you mentioned, the Whisper, which increases your damage done, but also reduces your max HP. So, of course, because it reduces your max HP, and Quaking and a lot of other affixes are percentage-based, the Quaking is, of course, not going to kill him. It just does percentage of his max HP, so it's going to do a lot less to Smok than it does to Divine Field, for example. But, of course, if there's any of those casts going through from those Forgotten Denizens, then he needs to dispel himself if they miscalculated their interrupts, because then he's definitely going to get one shot.
Yeah, I certainly want to stay on top of those interrupts. I know sometimes I purposely let it leak through just to make sure Jack dies in anger on that boss, but no problem for Abrakeydabra here as they wrap up. 3% left on them. They will get that Bloodlust rolling on Volzith here in just a moment. I expect to see it start flashing on the screen, and there it is right now. Aggressive CDs coming out of both sides. Avatar pop for Divine Field. The Adrenaline Rush is popped on the Rogues. Everybody getting as much in as they can to make sure that he does not enter another transition phase. And of course, Nagura, they'll likely clean up the last 3% with some of the eels on the side.
I'm pretty sure the last season we only had Shrine in a fortified setting, I believe. I don't think we ever had Tyrannical. So it's going to be interesting to see if they will make the damage here, because, you know, they do have the Bloodlust, but on a Tyrannical setting, it's definitely way more difficult to get this one phase out of here, as the boss is on 30%. And I do believe he's going to be casting this very soon, so we might see another intermission phase here. Intermission phase
indeed, 20% on Volzith. You're right, this is actually taking much longer. I'm going to stand right back up. I sat down too early for this, as Volzith is only now at 13%. Unfortunately, we don't have a snapshot of that energy level, but it should hit pretty soon as the manifestations of the beat try to come around right now. And here he's casting it. It looks like they're going to have another transition phase at 4%. If Syzygy manages... Syzygy is too far behind at this point. But if they were to be closer and manage to do this in one phase, they could have had an opportunity to catch up right now, but they've only now dealt with Lord Stormsong and will be going through the underwater passage over to the boss. Abrakeydabra just doing one more transition phase here. There, indeed, Nagura's prediction was correct. They were just short of damage.
Yes, actually, it was a lot closer than I thought it would be. On a Tyrannical setting, having for... Oh, Smok actually going down. They don't have a Battle Rest for Smok. Of course, as he's the only Druid, the only class who has a Battle Rest available to them. They should be able to finish it, though, because as long as Divine Field doesn't die, because the boss is on 4%, right? So they only have to make sure they deal with the intermission phase, get out, and make sure they finish up the boss.
Smok gets automatic jacked right now as he keels over in the transition phase. Somebody boo-booed and missed an interrupt, or they just ran out of interrupts if the phase was just too slow. But Volzith finally going down here, along with Smok, unfortunately, their first death of the tournament, of the weekend here. So Smok goes down, does a release to try and make it back quickly as the boss is dead, but they will be cleaning up the last 3% here with these eel packs on the side. But Syzygy just didn't work out for them. They'll be coming back with a vengeance later on to make sure that they sweep the next series.
Yeah, Smok, though, let's be honest here, it could definitely be someone else's mistake and not Smok's mistake here, so you can't blame him, but Abrakeydabra did a really good job so far.
Stop defending your druids.
I've even had a kick to begin with. Oh my goodness. Abrakeydabra found the magic trick to get that 2-0, but didn't find a way to be able to get those kicks. You even foreshadowed it, Sloon. It was so dirty.
You just shuddered. You're like, he didn't.
Imagine playing with a prop pally and then missing an interrupt.
Oh no, dude. Imagine thinking I missed it by accident.
Tattles, let's take it away. How's that Vengeance Demon Hunter been doing for Syzygy in this run?
Yeah, so Syzygy ends up pulling Windspeaker Heldus into Accuseer, like we were talking about a little bit earlier. The trash count rebalancing actually made both of these teams end up pulling way more mini bosses than you've seen previously. Of course, Abrakeydabra pulling like the Rune Carver, and they actually do end up pulling this Guardian Elemental too. Whether or not that was on purpose or not, to be be determined. It looks like Divine ends up or they end up messing a Shadow Meld there, but they do actually end up making their trash count end up working out. Unfortunately, though, Syzygy just not in position to be able to capitalize on a blunder from Abrakeydabra there, even though Abrakeydabra didn't have any deaths up until the very end, where a tank intentionally missed an interrupt, I guess is what we're calling it now, letting Zamok die. And then, of course, they are pulling onto Volzith here in just a couple seconds. They missed the percent on him, which is... I mean, so him at 4%, maybe the Resto Druid should be looking to play a little bit more damage heavy. I know Resto Druids can actually play Memory of Lucid Dreams if they want energy regen and stuff like that. He can play more. He can play more aggressive stuff if he also wants to. He doesn't have to play that, especially if you're going to be so close on the damage check. That's always something that you can actually be looking to do.
Always blaming the healer, even if you don't have enough damage, right?
Well, he ended up running with Crucible Major, so he had the very good single target nuke. But then after that, he also was running Artifice of Time to be able to buff all the other DPSers with that bonus haste. But we got a little bit with the changes in Beguiling. We've seen a lot of different changes in routing. So let's take a look at that Method Dungeon tools that you have for us, Tettles.
Yeah, so Method Dungeon tools has been recently updated, and with that, we actually did see a very interesting pull from Abrakeydabra after Accuseer. They actually pull these apprentices, initiates, and then all of this into this rune carver down here into the corner. Of course, they also do end up pulling these Iron Hole apprentices into the pack just a few seconds later. I kind of marked it off just so you can see that it did end up getting trickled in after they ended up dealing with some of these mobs. Of course, there's also an enchanted emissary there as well, but that just kept getting knocked back so that you can actually deal with that relatively easy. So whenever we show the clip as well, you'll actually see the Rune Carver coming out. And the Rune Carver, we haven't seen it very much, but it'll cast an ability called Carve Flesh. And basically, there's this ward that's on the ground that you need to be standing in whenever it is casting the Carve Flesh ability on you. Otherwise, it will probably end up killing you just because it does just a ridiculous amount of damage. Like I said earlier, the Rune Carvers are giving way more percent relative to the dungeon. As opposed to previous MDIs that we actually saw pretty much every single mini boss being skipped. It can actually be kind of scary, especially if you do have quaking and stuff like that, but that rune, that ward that's actually dropped on the ground makes you take reduced damage, so tanking the mobs next to it, not inside of it, is very important as well. And just a really good pull from Abrakeydabra in order for them to get a significant amount of count that is required for the course of the whole entire dungeon.
Yeah, it was very interesting to start seeing how these routes have been kind of growing and developing. And as you mentioned, they didn't really have to worry about quaking at all. So with Abrakeydabra getting that 2-0, they will continue on through that upper bracket and await the winner of our next series that we have coming up between Paint for Femme and 40K. So Paint for Femme, though, Nagura, has been kind of a merge of a number of different MDI teams from last season.
Yeah, it's I believe it's Shelly and Femme who were in Fallen ones, and then we have some other members who were in which team?
Don't look at me.
And I think they were in one of the teams last season.
You know what? You're probably right.
Exalted with Bwansamdi. I think it was
Exalted with Bwansamdi.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There we go.
We didn't see Pualuka coming back to the tournament for it, so I wanted to say that one. But as you mentioned, couple of teams that are kind of merging together onto this one and looking to be able to put on a good show. And Salute, after we'd had a chance to talk to them, they seemed a lot more confident going into this next season than they were previously.
Yeah, you had your chance to talk. Couldn't remember the team. Yeah, I mean, Shella raids with us in future. Fem used to raid. He's not retired. He's just, our real life responsibilities, work, etc.
He couldn't handle
hates raiding with me. But, Shella was very worried about their team's ability to get practice time in versus some of the high tier teams like Abrakeydabra and the Method teams as well. But now, as of I would say the past 2 weeks, they've really reached, or the past week, excuse me, they've really reached a new height of confidence. They say they can tangle with some of the best teams. I mean, they're talking a big talk. I'm not sure if they can walk the walk with it as well, but they're confident they could beat the best of the best and be on top for the cups this season. So we'll see how they have to do.